Thank you
Of
for
course, thank
taking
you.
the
Thank
time.
y'all.
I'm going to go straight to Nicole. I don't know if anybody knows how familiar Nicole looks. She came
Maybe I
out.
should say some bad words.
Yeah, her video went viral, I think around in May. Am I correct?
Yeah, beginning of
She's
May.
is a nurse whistleblower from NYC. She was on Del Bigtree, the High Wire last week. And Nicole, I'll let you tell the story. But thank you.
Sure. So my name, sorry, my little kids are eating dinner right next to me in the background. So like I'm gonna be a little like all over the place. So my name's Nicole Tech. Unfortunately, most people know me from that foul-mouthed video of me begging for help to help save my patient's life when I was in New York, responding to the COVID pandemic. And what most people don't actually know about me is I'm actually, I've been a nurse for a decade, and I've been an ICU/flight nurse for 7 of those 10 years. And I also have a background in biochemistry and psychology. So I actually had a career or profession like before nursing. And I've worked in genomics and genetics and stuff like that too. So most people try to discredit me, saying that I was either A, just a nurse, or B, I was a home health nurse. Of course, I didn't know what was going on in NYC. And both of those are actually incorrect. I mean, I've always been a home health nurse. As nurses, most of us work like 2 or 3 jobs so we can pay like our student loans and stuff back. And so when I went to New York to help out, I did it because I thought, it was like part of it is like patriotic. Like my mom raised me to be very proud that we live in America because we have so many more opportunities than in many other countries, because I come from a family of immigrants. And so I'm like, this is our, like, if you can go, you should go. And I was able to help and leave. And so I left my family behind. And my daughter was only like 4 months old at the time. Okay, we will clean it up in a second, bud. And I go to the pandemic in like the middle of NYC, and I get put out there, and it was pretty apparent that I was the only one that was like comfortable in my little cohort that got sent to the hospital, managing a ventilator, managing ABGs, managing drips and stuff like that. And it's not because I'm like some super great nurse and I'm like the best nurse in the world. If you ask any paramedic that's worked with me in flight, I'm actually just rather average. And so if average was better than what they had, that's a little concerning. And so, in flight, we do as nurses manage ventilators and intubations and things like that. As an ICU nurse in a hospital, I did not manage an ventilators or intubate or anything like that. So I can kind of see how like some of the nurses, even who were critical care, weren't comfortable with managing a ventilator, because I didn't even know how to fully manage a ventilator until I became a flight nurse. And so, I got there and they're giving us this little crash course orientation before they sent us out to the units, and they're like, who knows how to manage a ventilator? And I raised my hand. I was the only one. Who can read ABGs? And everyone's like, well, I did it a couple years ago. I did it in nursing school. And I'm like, I can. He's like, who is actually ICU? I'm like, I was 10 years ago, and I was like 4 years ago. I did a semester of student nursing in the ICU. And I'm like, yeah, like 7 years. And he's like, so you're like the most like comfortable? And I'm like, yeah, like whatever you need, I can do anything. And I literally, from the beginning, I said I could do anything other than run a dialysis machine, because I didn't have to worry about the ORs because they were kind of closed. Like they wouldn't stick me in an OR because I don't know anything about OR. And they put he's like, I'm going to put you on the unit where nobody knows anything about ventilators and nobody knows anything about intubating, and most people don't even know the drugs. And I'm like, okay. He's like, they're probably going to be mean to you. And I'm like, what's new? What else is new in nursing? Like, I can take my hits. It's okay. So I go there, and it was chaotic and it was crazy. And so for the first 2 shifts, I'm just like, wow, this is really bad. It's just like the news. Because, as an undergraduate and graduate student, my professors had warned me that we were due for a pandemic, just that something would severely threaten like human life, and it would be like a virus. Like they're like, everyone's always worried about war. It's gonna be like a virus, an evolutionary thing. And they said jump the species barrier and everything. And I'm like, wow, it's really just like my professors say. And then the more you pay attention, the more you go from code to code. Because once we got there, they're like, oh, everybody's like a DNR. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's not how it works. And I get there and I never had more than 2 patients at a time. I mean, sometimes I helped a lot with other patients, but I never had more than 2 patients at a time. And everyone was able to have lunch breaks. That was like the first time ever in like my nursing career I had a lunch break. I'm like, what? Are we in a pandemic? We had like all the basic stuff and stuff like that, except for like circuits for the ventilators. And you're running from code to code, and it's very obvious that people don't know how to place 12 leads. People don't know how to intubate. People like don't know. A lot of them, especially like the residents, didn't even know basic ACLS. And at first I was like really impressed because like all these residents spoke Spanish, and that's like the second most predominant language in the United States. I'm like, oh wow, these people, that's really great. Everyone's learning Spanish. They know that it's like you're going to deal with a lot of Spanish speaking patients. That's like so good. So hard to find people that speak Spanish and stuff like that. And then it come to find out that a lot of them are residents from other countries. And I'm like, I thought AHA, the American Heart Association, and ACLS and BLS and PALS and all that was like international, but I guess a lot of people don't have to take it. And so we're running these codes and nobody knows what they're doing. And I'm like, is somebody going to jump back on that chest? Like, you got to keep pumping. Like, does anybody have any epi? Like, where's the epi? And, you know, one guy had a pneumothorax, and I'm like, does anybody know how to needle decompress? Oh, sorry, needle decompress. And they're like, nobody, not even the residents. And I'm like, I don't feel like I'm advanced. I don't feel like I'm some super great nurse. I'm really average. And a lot of people didn't feel comfortable. And then as you go, like, you see all the rooms, nobody's on end-tidal, which is a standard of care for ventilators to check like their CO2 levels. People are breathing at respirations, like ventilators are set at 6 breaths per minute. You know, people didn't know the basic drugs. And then you start finding out like the backgrounds of these people, and they're all like, a lot of them are good people. But I mean, I was there with the school nurse who, like, you know, whatever school nurses do, because I'm not a school nurse and nurses are specialized. She was a middle school nurse, and one was a student nurse, and one was an OB nurse. And I'm like, well, I guess I can see why they sent me. But then, like, when you try and correct somebody, they're like, they got tired of like listening to me, and I didn't correct people in a rude way. I'm like, hey, you should probably put your patient on end-tidal. It's like a standard of care for ventilators, and it tells you about cardiac perfusion and stuff like that, just like ACLS says. I'm like, I'm not a genius. It's in a book that we're required to take. And they're like, if I have to hear end-tidal out of you one more time, and I'm like, you should know that you have ROSP, which is like spontaneous, you know, recirculation of the heart and everything when your end-tidal's 40. So why the hell are you compressing if his end-tidal's 50? This is literally ACLS. Like, there's a question on the test, and it's an open book test. You can go find the answer. And so things were just chaotic. And then there was this one guy I was working with, and he wasn't even a nurse. And I'm like, and you know, when you talk shop with people with your profession, you can kind of find like if people know what they're talking about and stuff. And he didn't know what he was talking about. And I'm like, what are you talking? Like, you don't seem to really be knowledgeable at all. Like, you can't call yourself a nurse unless you know a certain baseline. And nothing's changed from New York. My nose still runs. And, you know, the more you get talking, and he's like, I've been here for 2 weeks, and like every single one of my patients have died. This virus is so bad. And like, he's always asking people questions on what he's supposed to do. And I'm like, a nursing student would know that answer. And so then, you know, you slowly start finding out a little bit about people, and then you Google him and you find out he doesn't even have a nursing license. And I mean, like, when I got back to the hotel, I literally like checked all 50 states, and that's not an exaggeration. Every single state, all 50 of them, I searched his name. And then the next night I searched it on EMS. And then I searched social media, and the guy was a construction worker. He wasn't even a nurse. And I'm like, dude, your name badge says nurse, but you're a construction worker. He's like, how'd you, like, why do you say that? And I'm like, because this is your damn company profile, and that's your face right there, and you have no license. And he's like, well, you can't prove anything. And I'm just like, for reals? For reals? And I like try and charge, like talk to the charge nurse about it, and she's like, well, he wouldn't be here if he wasn't a nurse. And I'm like, I'm literally showing you his picture. He is not a nurse. He has no license. I checked all 50 states. And then they wouldn't do anything. And then I try and tell the staffing company, and they're like, well, he's not even ours. Like, they can't do anything if he's not their employee. You know, because remember, they were bringing on, they needed hundreds of nurses. So do you really think the average company who's like onboarding like 100 people like every 2 or 3 days can verify all those licenses? I mean, just for the state of Nevada, it can take approximately 5 minutes per license. And then I have to go to admin, and nobody did anything then. And then I'm like, I'm just gonna like get the police. Like, do I call 911 inside the hospital? Like, I don't need, like, what do you do? I've never been in that situation before. And so I get security, and our security is actual NYPD. And I'm like, hey, this is a situation. I have told everybody, nobody's doing anything. He's killing people. Like, literally, it's murder. He doesn't have a license. And I mean, everything you do is wrong, and they're dying. And they go and they try to talk to the guy, and the guy freaking ran. And I'm like, well, that should tell you something. And I've never saw him again. Nobody came and did any follow-up or anything.
Wait a minute. He ran like off the floor?
Like he like ran away. Like he stole something, ran. Like he did a B&E. I don't know. He ran away. And we never saw him again. And I'm like, well, are you guys gonna do something? Like, he's getting paid, so there's gotta be like a name, a number.
So Nicole, are they just hired anybody? Because
Oh no, I think what happened is like when you like get with the staffing agencies, because it was like emergency, they were boarding people on so
Okay,
fast.
I
Because like
see,
he
yeah.
wasn't with the company that I worked for. But then again, like they didn't even ask me to show up with my license either. I'm like, I showed up with it. I'm like, do you need this? Do you want my vaccine records too? Like, do you want my ACLS and my BLS? Because honest to God, you don't go anywhere like without the license and the ACLS
Right.
and the BLS. Like, you know, those are the 3 things that will at least get you through the door anywhere. And I've never worked for a staffing agency before, ever. And so I'm like, is this how it works? I'm pretty sure it's a little bit more stringent, maybe because everything's an emergency, but they were onboarding people so fast
Right.
that he was able to slip through the cracks. And then, you know, chaos. Hey, what do you need more? Okay. Why don't you go sit in your seat? And onboarding them so fast that they weren't checking the licenses. They were assuming everybody was a good person and a nurse trying to help. And because remember, they were paying, all these companies were paying lots of money because they wanted you to go to a place where there was no PPE, the possibility of dying, and stuff like that.
Don't worry about him. He's fine.
Oh, yeah.
So they didn't have enough nurses for their regular staff?
No, it was pretty bad before I got there. Like you can see the remnants of like, I've worked in refugee camps before. I've seen like some bad stuff. So you can tell things were bad. You definitely could tell. And like there was what couple nurses at the first hospital I was at, there was actually an entire unit dedicated just to the staff who was sick and on ventilators, their own staff. So I mean, it was bad. It wasn't like a hoax or anything. People were getting sick.
Right.
But what escalated or accelerated the death process were all of the inappropriate nursing professional selections, because people always thought a nurse is a nurse because they never truly understood what we did as professionals. They just thought we passed out pills and, you know, wiped butts and, you know, folded linen. And I'm like, for reals? That's what you guys thought of us? We literally keep you alive. I mean, it's in the research, we're like the #1 best defense against death is a good nurse and appropriate staffing ratios. And so they onboarded everybody that was a nurse, and that brought a lot of like the inappropriate skill set. And there were a lot of good people there. But the problem is that they didn't have the skill set because they needed to manage ventilators, because nobody thought to, I don't know, get respiratory therapists. Because once again, they just wanted nurses, remember? Nobody thought to get respiratory therapists or CNAs or, you know, physical therapists or more phlebotomists or more rad techs. They just said nurses because they didn't have a full comprehension of the medical system, and that we work all together as a team for better patient outcomes. And so stuff like that is what happened. I mean, I ran up to another unit to get some supplies. There were some pressure relieving devices on one unit that I had caught word of. And so I was on my phone and I was like booking it to that supply room, because, you know, if I'm away from my patients, nobody's watching them. They're just these patients on ventilators, unsupervised. What if something happens? Because nobody goes to your code. Nobody's going to answer any alarms that go off. because they didn't want you in the rooms. And so I'm booking it, trying to get these pressure relieving devices. And this girl comes out of like a patient room, and this was an impromptu like ICU unit. These used to be offices, because you can see people's like pictures of their families up on the wall, and like diplomas and like the placard names. This was not even supposed to be a medical unit. And she comes out and she's crying, she's hyperventilating, like freaking out. She's like, my patient's dying, I don't know what to do. And I go in there, and I noticed that the ventilator is set at 6 breaths per minute, because we have to assess so many things at once. And she didn't know that. And so I'm like, go get help, get a code. Because remember, these are offices. These don't have code buttons. You have to just yell out the hall, they're dying, get in here. We had no communication system. And, I try to like bump up the respirations, and the guy's tanking, and now we got to do compressions, and she's over there like crying outside the patient room. And I'm like, dude, you're the primary nurse. Get in here. Give us a report. What's going on with this guy? Like, we don't know what's going on. And she's like, I'm only like, I just graduated school like a month ago. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You just graduated school a month ago. And I'm like, what? Like, none of it made any sense. Because here's the thing, a new graduate nurse, an OB nurse, a PACU nurse, all those nurses have a foundation of nursing, and they could have been utilized effectively.
Right.
If paired with somebody who did have some type of critical care knowledge. I mean, shoot, we could have brought paramedics in.
Mm-hmm.
We could have brought EMTs in. Like, there's a lot that specialty could have done in the hospital setting to help alleviate and provide better patient care. Because I can tell you right now, everything I learned about vents and intubations and things like that, I learned from paramedics. So pair a nurse with a paramedic, and I'm pretty sure you got the whole team. Or maybe just have a good thorough plan, like having respiratory therapists.
Right.
And maybe having the appropriate types of doctors, and not podiatrists and ophthalmologists. And what was the other one? I took orders from a pediatrician. I wasn't on a pediatric unit. And a podiatrist. There was another guy. I think he was like, I want to say he was an orthopedic doc. One was a GI doc. And I'm like, you obviously don't really know respiratory. I can see that's not your specialty. But you're doing that wrong, and we really shouldn't do that. And they're like, well, this is what the intending said. And I'm like, and I'm pretty much telling you, I'm not going to do that. I'm really not going to do that. So you're going to fix all these orders, and we're just not going to do that. And I'm not saying I'm smarter than a doctor, but here's the thing. We're trained to see that. We don't just blindly do what people tell us to do. Because if somebody told me to go give somebody like 1,000 like grams of like morphine, I'm going to be like, no, that's like a wrong dose. That's going to hurt somebody. I don't just go and give 1,000 grams of morphine. And I know that's a really like insane number, but just so people know, I had to get a big number, because they don't know, like, for non-medical. But we just don't blindly follow what is told. And if you don't toe the line, then you get in trouble. And so like, these were the things that were going on that people didn't pay attention to. And I'm like, I have seen laboratory values there that I have never seen. And I'm like, did you spill your water? It's okay. And there were times when I'm like, a person could be dead in a room and nobody even knew. I'm like, how long has this guy been dead? And this ventilator has been working on him. Did anybody notice? And they're like, oh. Or like, somebody's alarm was going off on their ventilator. And I'm like, dude, are you going to go in there? That's an alarm on a ventilator. Oh, it's fine. It always alarms. And I'm like, then you need to check it. I know that there's this thing called alarm fatigue, but like, we know when our pumps are just being particular, but it's a ventilator. You need to go check it. And I go in there, and the guy had like a leak, because nobody has a manometer. And for anyone who doesn't know, a manometer is that, like, it looks like a blood pressure bulb, and you check the pressure inside the endotracheal cuff. And it has to have a certain amount of pressure or air leaks out of it. And so it like had this air leak, and I just go in there, and I'm like, because we don't have manometers, I had to old school it. And I figure that out, and I, put more air into the ET tube cuff to minimal occlusion. And then I'm like, hey, I just, he was leaking air, and I fixed your ET tube cuff pressure. And she's like, oh, okay. And I'm like, do you want to go in there and double check like what I did for safety, an extra set of assessment? And she's like, I'm sure it's fine. And I'm like, are you sure? Like, what if I killed him? What if he's dead? Like, I don't mind somebody checking my work. It's good if someone checks all of our work. And then there was just like processes. I'm like, who are you? Why are you in my patient's room? Oh, well, I'm so and so, because none of us were clearly identified. It's why I wrote my name on my paper scrubs. And then there were other times they didn't even want us like going into the patient rooms. They like ran like 6 feet of IV tubing, and I can kind of understand that. But my job is to check that patient and check him at least every 2 hours at a minimum when I'm not running my tail off from like craziness to craziness. And other people like literally wouldn't go in there like except for 4 times a shift. And I was at least averaging once an hour, and I would come and go from those rooms. And like there was a time we ran out of like the drapes and stuff, like the plastic gowns or the paper gowns or whatever to cover ourselves. And they're like, well, we can't go into any of the rooms until we get more of those. And I'm like, you're just gonna let them die because you don't have a paper bag?
Right.
And I'm just like, you have an N95.
Right.
You have an N95 and you have gloves. Get in there. This isn't like nuclear radiation. Like the N95 will protect you and you have gloves. You can do anything with that. And so I would go in there all the time. And the longer I was there, the more and more I realized that like what the news was saying was like out of control. Because yes, it was bad. Don't get me wrong by any means. People were dying, but how much of it was because of negligence?
Right.
There was another time I went up to a different unit to get some IV tubing. And there was this little like maybe Cambodian lady in her bed, and she was there and she was like reaching and her fingers were just on like the overbed table, and it was her breakfast tray, but it was 2 or 3 a.m. So she was served breakfast sometime between 7 and 9. So where's the lunch and dinner tray? And you guys just left it there? You didn't even like open the milk carton?
Yeah.
Like, because I mean, people like there's certain things like you got to set up their tray. I mean, like feed her, give her water or something. And she wasn't on a ventilator or anything. And I'm like, and then the next day she's gone because she's dead. And I'm like, well, how many of these people did we starve to death? I mean, I got a patient, by the time I had gotten him, he'd been on the unit for like a week, and nobody thought to get a feeding pump to feed him. And then he was diabetic, so now he's in diabetic ketoacidosis because nobody's fed him. And they couldn't figure out why his blood sugars were going crazy, and he's on a ventilator. And I'm like, what? Like, you can't starve people to death. And I mean, like, we're running concentrated drugs in, so because we don't want to fluid volume overload him. So I'm like, no wonder he's having pressure issues. Don't put another pressor on him. He's hypovolemic. You haven't given him enough fluid to keep his cardiovascular system going. Look at it. It's in the labs. It tells you. We're supposed to assess these things. And everybody just said, COVID, 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 and we're all going to die. This is all so bad. And I'm like, we still have to exercise our common sense and our training and skills and our knowledge. We can't just like lose our minds.
Right.
I mean, there was another time where the resident was like telling this family, your husband's doing good. He's critical, but this is, at least a good critical. Like I've seen worse, and we're hoping to pull him through. And, I'm like, wow, that's like, thanks for telling the family that. And then you find out that's not even the patient that was in the room. It was like an old lady. And I'm like, that guy had been dead for several days already. How many days have you been telling the family that he was okay and he's been like in a body bag somewhere in the freezer truck or something?
Oh my God.
And then there was like, and what most people don't understand is like, after each holiday, there's always a huge surge because people gather, and then like they go and like see grandma or grandpa or somebody that's a high risk person. And then we get these surges of these people coming in. And I arrived after Easter, and the surge was really bad. It was so bad that people were dying so fast because like, they're overwhelmed the healthcare system and we can't care for them all. And then a component with ARDS is that their kidneys shut down, they start to retain fluid, they like swell. So a lot of times people didn't have armbands on, and they would just stick the armbands to the front door of the patient. And so as people died, nobody had armbands on. And that was like one of the first things. I'm like, dude, if you were literally putting 3 or 4 of these people on a gurney to go to the morgue at a time, how the hell do you know who they are? So like the first thing I did, any patient I got, is I wrote their name and date of birth, like in Sharpie on their leg, if they had a leg. And that way it was kind of not noticeable, because someone was like, that's really rude that you did that. And I'm like, you've obviously never, done mass casualty. We got to put tags down. But identifying these people is kind of important. And with the Las Vegas shooting, it was kind of an issue being able to identify people, because nobody had their IDs with them, And so like from that situation and from being overseas and not being able to identify bodies, I want people to know who they are. Their family's going to do services or something. I will like do that. And like, sure enough,
Oh, we can't really hear you, Nicole. You'll come a little
hold
close.
on. My
That's
phone
okay.
is drum. I got them. And so we get this message that gets texted out to us like, hey, there's like 9 unidentified bodies in the morgue. And what do you mean there's 9 unidentified bodies in the morgue? And then nursing admin is coming around and they're asking, did anybody die on this unit last night? In the past couple days? We got 9 of them. Like, who's had a patient that's died? And I'm like, they wanted us to go down and try and identify the bodies. Because like in the software, you should be able to take a picture of the person, upload it. But like I said, they're coming in so fast, you can't do that. And I'm just like, are you kidding me? You want me to go down there and see if I know any of these people? Like,